I would like to look at chapter 12 of Revelation. This chapter has been called the center of the book of Revelation, not just because it's at the midpoint of Revelation chapters and content, but because it's the center of the message of Revelation. The symbolic message going on here, everything else in Revelation revolves around this particular symbolic message that we see here, the visions of chapter 12. I want to show you that chapter 12 now is the beginning of a new section of Revelation. The opening of the seals of the scroll is behind us. The seven trumpet judgments are behind us, and the subsections of those trumpet judgments, the two witnesses and so on. That's behind us now. We're looking at a separate section of Revelation. Commentators have outlined this in different ways. If you want to know the boundaries of this section, I would say that it goes from chapter 12 through verse 4 of chapter 15. Chapter 12 through verse 4 of chapter 15. Now, chapter 15, the first 4 verses there, is a vision of the resurrection, I believe. So that closes out this series of visions here. There's a sort of a logical progression to the visions in this section of Revelation. These are not just discrete visions that come up with no connection to anything. There's a logical flow or progression to this. And so today in chapter 12, verses 1 through 17, we see visions related to the woman and the dragon. And I'm going to tell you what I think that signifies. Then, that chapter 12 is broken into 2 sections, verses 1 through 6. It summarizes the conflict between the woman and the serpent. And then verses 7 through 17, the second part of chapter 12, we're looking at the spiritual origins of this conflict. Where did this conflict come from? Then, in chapter 13, the entire chapter, 2 sections there, that describe 2 of the instruments used by the dragon and his allies in their war against God and his people. 2 of the instruments. The beast from the sea and the beast from the land. We've already seen that there are many, many instruments used by the evil one against God and his people. The swarms of demonic locusts that we looked back, that we saw a while back. I said, are the spiritual reality behind the swarms of false gods and goddesses that people worship, and the swarms of ideologies, godless, destructive ideologies that people worship. Okay, and then in chapter 14, through that the 4th verse of chapter 15, we get an insight as to the spiritual reality of God's people during this period of conflict. Now again, there's a forward-looking element to this, but what we're seeing here describes dynamics that are at work in the entire period since Christ's first advent until his second advent. You have to understand it that way. Everything that's going on here is describing a dynamic of some sort that happens again and again and again until Christ comes back. All right, so with that in mind now, I'm going to jump right in. Chapter 12 of Revelation. Verses 1 through 6. I'm going to go through this a little bit at a time. Chapter 12, verse 1. A great sign appeared in heaven. It's the beginning of a new vision. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Obviously a symbolic image of some sort, but what is it pointing to? Now, some commentators say that this is a parallel or perhaps even a borrowing from pagan mythology, specifically the goddess Leto, pregnant with her son Apollo, the son of Zeus. When Leto was pregnant, she was attacked by the dragon Python because Python knew that her son had been appointed to kill him. So Leto was carried to safety on an island on winds sent by Zeus. And the sea god Poseidon lowered the island beneath the sea so that Python could not find the island or the woman and her child. And then 4 days after Apollo was born, he killed Python. It's pagan mythology. And some Bible scholars would say that John was simply borrowing from pagan mythology. Aside from the fact that that would have been a scandal to his churches, and aside from the fact that, that would have been a huge scandal to his churches, it's more likely to believe that John was again drawing on images from the Old Testament to describe this heavenly being. Right? These pagan myths, like Leto and all the others, and some modern religions show echoes of the true gospel. Okay? There are echoes of the true gospel in the pagan mythologies and modern religions, Islam, Mormonism, for example. But they are simply garbled versions of the truth. And John would say, if you had asked him, Leto and Python and that whole mythological thing, I'm not drawing on that. But that's a misinterpretation of the true gospel, which I am presenting to you. So what now is the meaning of this vision? Well, the woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars comes out of Genesis 37. Remember Joseph's dream. Joseph dreamed another dream and told it to his father, his brothers, and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in his mind. That's where this vision's coming from. The sun in the Old Testament passage is Jacob. The moon is his wife, Joseph's mother, Rachel. The crown of 12 stars are Isaac's 12 sons by his various wives, the ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel. There are 11 stars mentioned in the Old Testament story, but 12 in the New because it had Joseph. So taken together, this woman in this vision symbolizes God's people in all ages. Just as the 24 elders that we saw symbolize God's people in all ages, or the 144,000 symbolize God's people in all ages. This woman symbolizes God's people in all ages. Do you follow that? Do you follow how that works? Okay? The Old Testament vision is dealing with the progenitors of Israel. John is using that to symbolize God's people in all ages. Verse 2, she was pregnant and crying out in birth pangs and the agony of giving birth. Well, this agony that this woman is in, these birth pangs, are likely a reference to the persecution experienced by God's people all the way from the murder of Abel to the end of the world. In fact, Jesus specifically links persecution to birth pangs. In Matthew 24, I'm going to read a fairly long passage, verses 4 to 13. Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of war. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All of these are but the beginning of the birth pains. And they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. And you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. Because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved." And again, chapter 16 of John's Gospel, he plays another tune. Okay? He touches on this theme. Truly, truly, I say to you, you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn into joy. When a woman has given birth, when a woman is giving birth, she has sorrow because her hour has come. But when she has delivered the baby, she no longer remembers the anguish for joy that a human being has been born into the world. So also, you have sorrow now. But I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take your joy from you. So the opening of this vision is a reference to Christ's people throughout history, from the murder of Abel all the way down to the end of the world, suffering persecution by unbelievers for his sake. That's what's going on there. Verse 3, another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems. The dragon in the Old Testament can refer to the various evil kingdoms that rebel against God and oppress Israel. Isaiah 26, for example, behold, the Lord is coming out of his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. And the earth will disclose the blood shed on it, and no more cover its slain. In that day, the Lord, with his hard and great and strong sword, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. Ezekiel 29, referencing the judgment on Pharaoh. Thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great dragon that lies in the midst of the streams, that says, my Nile is my own, I made it for myself. I will put hooks in your jaws and make the fish of your streams stick to your scales. I will draw you out of the midst of your streams with all the fish of your streams that stick to your scales. Judgment on Pharaoh, the dragon of the Nile. And then in Isaiah 51, the dragon is referred to also as Rahab. He says, awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in days of old, the generations of long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? These are images of the nations, the kingdoms, the empires that oppress God's people. And, Jesus himself told us, if they receive you, they receive me. If they hate you, they hate me. God has so identified himself with his people that whatever is done to his people is done to him. So this dragon represents persecution, persecuting kingdoms, persecuting empires, powers that oppose God and his people. But they have no access to God himself, so they take out their rage and their wrath on his people. The horns, the heads, the diadems, and all that, these are just symbols of sovereignty and military and political power, each one of them. Okay? And one of the commentators says this is just a mosaic of Old Testament imagery of evil kingdoms who persecute God's people. The 10 horns is a reference back to the 4th beast in Daniel 7, who emerged from the sea. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth, it devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. So, the dragon is a metaphor for evil kingdoms generally, but it also stands for the instigator of those evil kingdoms, the devil himself. Just as Jesus is the federal head of his people, okay, the dragon is the federal head of all the evil kingdoms of the world who oppress God's people and hate God. Again, I'm quoting, the devil is the grand initiator of the trials and persecutions of the saints. But the devil is not autonomous. He and his angels can only persecute saints within divinely prescribed time frames, such as the 1,260 days, or the time and times and half a time, or the 42 months, or the 3.5 years. Those all correlate simply to this time of persecution when the church militant on earth must labor to remain faithful to Jesus against opposition that has its roots ultimately in sin. In fact, this commentator goes on, the devil is enraged and attacks Christians because his decisive defeat has already been set in motion by Christ's resurrection, and his time of rage is limited by God. I'm trying to see if I want to read the next one. Do you get that? Do you see what's going on there? Everything we've seen up to this point leads me to believe that have we seen a rapture where the church will be removed before things really get bad? No. Everything we've seen up to this point is that the church remains on earth, and that the power of evil that persecutes the church is within the sovereign power of God. There's nothing outside the sovereign power of God. All right, verse 4. His tail, the dragon's tail, swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And this is back to Daniel chapter 8. He describes this persecutor which grew great, even to the host of heaven. And some of the host and some of the stars flew down to the ground and trampled on them. Now the stars in the Old Testament can refer to two sets of beings. Angels and professing people of God. And so the stars that are swept out of heaven in this passage, his tail swept 30%, 1/3 of the stars from heaven, can refer to the fallen angels who were cast out of heaven with Satan in their abortive rebellion against God. It can refer to them. But, and this is very sobering, it can also be referred to as God's people, professors of faith, who failed to be faithful during persecution, just as the fallen angels were unfaithful. By turning away from Christ under the pressure of persecution, Christians show themselves and remaining in that, not repenting of it, but by simply giving up on the Christian faith. Those Christians who do that show that they have aligned themselves with the dragon. They are among those stars swept from heaven, the presence of God. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. All the way from the very beginning, Satan was ready to oppose the woman's child. There might be a reference here to the flight into Egypt and the massacre of the innocents at the beginning of Jesus' life. Might be a reference to his death on the cross when Satan thought that he had triumphed over him. But the purpose of the dragon from the very beginning, when God began to gather his people, all right, is to destroy the one spoken of in Genesis 3, the seed of the woman, the descendant of the woman who would crush him and destroy him and his people. Verse 5, she gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Reference to that in Psalm 2, verses 7 through 9, that messianic psalm. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. When the Messiah comes, when Christ appears in glory, all the wicked kingdoms of the world will be accountable. He will crush them. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Again, an obvious reference to Jesus' resurrection, his ascension, his glorification at the right hand of the Father. According to 1 Peter, Jesus has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him. And we've seen examples of that subjection, haven't we, throughout Revelation so far. The evil one does nothing unless it has first been given to him by Christ or the Father. Evil has no power beyond what is given to him by God, by Jesus, by the Father. I'm going to pause there before we move on to verse 6. Anybody? Observations, questions?
Here you are.
Yes, Gene.
Probably a dumb question, but I take from this that God, who is sovereign, is testing people to see how true they are through these tribulations and what have you.
Yes. That's one reason why God places us in positions where we must endure persecution and testing and trial. It's a test in the sense that, gold is tested in fire so as you can determine the purity of it, right? Well, God tests his people so that the slag, you might say, rises to the surface to be skimmed off. It makes us pure. I mean, even that hard-bitten old syphilitic atheist Nietzsche said, that which does not kill me makes me strong. Okay? Well, the Bible talks about that. That's why when misfortunes befall us, or sicknesses, or persecution, the evil intent of other people, we need to learn to accept what we can't prevent as coming from God for our benefit. And one of the benefits is that our faith will be made stronger and more pure. Go ahead.
Can the word devil and Satan be used interchangeably?
Sure. Devil comes from diabolos, Satan, Satanas. The word Satan was actually not a proper name. It was a title, Satanas, the accuser. We'll see that in just a second here. But over time, yes, these things, they become interchangeable. The dragon is Satan. Satan is the dragon, the devil, okay? The chief of the evil powers who have set themselves against God in this era, this age. All right, and the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Well, there it is again. This reference to the wilderness is very, very interesting because in the Old Testament and the New, the wilderness is a place of refuge for God's people as well as a place of danger. Israel in the wilderness during the Exodus was pursued by Pharaoh's army. And yet God provided for them and cared for them in the wilderness. Jesus in the wilderness during his temptation was tempted by Satan, but God provided for him in the wilderness. And so the wilderness in verse 6, I think, is just a reference to the world we live in. It's the world we live in. It's full of hazards and dangers to our faith, and yet we are nourished by God during the period that the church is in the world, 1,260 days, that period of persecution and suffering. Now, does anybody have any comments about that? Anything you'd like to bring up? All right, moving on. Where did this conflict originate, though? How did this happen? And we see in verses 7 through 9, actually 7 through 9, the origin of the conflict goes back to the war in heaven. The war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated. There was no longer any place for them in heaven. The dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to earth, and his angels thrown down with him. Reference back to the original revolt between Satan and God. Satan, Lucifer, the son of the morning, greatest of all created beings, somehow in some inexplicable way decided to be equal with God. Some commentators will say that when Satan saw how God loved humanity at the creation, Adam and his wife, and that God had given humanity sovereignty over the world, Satan and his angels in heaven didn't like that. So they rebelled against that.
Carl?
Yes.
Some good support reading for this passage is I finally got around to reading recently the handouts you gave us maybe a month or so ago. The 2 chapters on angels and
Oh, yeah,
demons from Puritan theology.
From Puritan theology.
I mean, after reading that, which was, if you haven't read it, I'd recommend it for anyone who has received it. It was very, very good. And it's excellent background, albeit not inspired, but excellent background for these verses right here.
Good. Yeah, if you have that handout I gave out, how many of you still have it? I mean, if you do, read it.
It's very good.
It's the Puritan view of devils and angels.
Yes, 2 chapters.
Very helpful.
Very, very good.
Very helpful. 2 chapters out of a 1,000-page volume called Puritan Theology, I believe is the title.
And it is readable. For those who haven't read it, it is
Thank you.
readable.
Thank you.
It's not.
I tell people things are readable unless I don't read a word of it. But thank you, that comes from Chet. It is readable. All right. He's referred to here as the deceiver of the whole world. What was Satan's first act on earth? What was the serpent's first act on earth? The Nakash. Remember I talked about the Nakash. What was his first act on earth? It was to deceive Adam and his wife. And that work of deception continues throughout history. Excuse me. The demonic locusts are examples of satanic deception, the false religions that people commit to, the destructive ideologies. All of these things result from the satanic deception. People's minds and hearts are darkened unless they have within them the spirit of truth. This is why we are counseled in Ephesians to put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. I made reference to Dostoevsky's book, Demons, in which the demons never appear. They manifest only as the ideas that people commit to. Anarchism, communism, socialism, all the other isms that people turn to build a better world that results in bloodshed. That goes back to those locusts and the horsemen, the demonic horsemen. Okay? That's the area of conflict here. And that's why it's so important for you Christians to take the time to become grounded both in Christ through the discipline of prayer and meditation, and also through the study of the Word. They go together. By reading the Bible and studying it and meditating on it, you are learning the mind of God and His intent for His people. And like I pulled apart that chapter from Genesis this morning at the early service, where Abraham failed again. And it had awful consequences again and again and again and again. What we draw from that story is what?
Human nature.
Well, human nature, but what about it? What's the purpose of that story? Why did I say it was given to us? To show us that God remains faithful when we are not. And that our salvation doesn't depend on our faithfulness, the strength of your faith, the level of your obedience. Salvation depends on the faithfulness of God to us. That ought to be good news to you. That ought to be something that liberates you. Although I had a visit with somebody this week who's involved in some stuff, and the person said, "Well, Carl, you've told us that if we fall, God will, forgive us." I said, "Yeah, but that doesn't mean that you're supposed to go out and fall.
Again and again.
It doesn't mean you can presume on God, right? Don't play that game with me. I don't fight." In this spiritual warfare, we do possess the Spirit of truth that preserves His people from error. John 14, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments. I will ask the Father, and He will give you another helper to be with you forever, even the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it neither sees Him nor knows Him. You know Him, for He dwells with you and will be in you." The world has no concept of the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit as the Spirit of truth, who enables us to see the world from a brand new perspective. Revelation is opening that perspective to us. All right, now the second part of this chapter, verses 10 through 12, John shows us that Satan's influence on earth will not last forever. I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, "The salvation and power and kingdom of our God and the authority of Christ have come. The accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God." It means it's a reference, he's thrown down from heaven. "They have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they have not loved their lives even unto death." So we conquer Satan even in this world by fidelity to Christ that remains firm, even if we are asked to sacrifice our lives. That's how we conquer Satan in this world. We conquer the evil one in this world by entering into a life in which we desire holiness more and more and more. Not pietism that says by doing good works and by becoming a holy Joe, I'm going to get to heaven. No. We seek to become more conformed to the image of Christ because we've been saved. And by becoming more and more conformed to the image of Christ, and by overcoming temptations, that's how we defeat Satan. That's how we conquer him during this period of our lives. Okay? "Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them." Why? Because God's given his saints the power to conquer even now. "But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short." So even though Christians can glorify God and honor Jesus Christ by the way they live, and by the way they live, conquer Satan, defeat Satan, okay? Satan's still hard at work in the world. And now we see that in verses 13 through 17. "When the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time, and half a times." Okay? Again, a reference back to in the world being nourished by God. "The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman to sweep her away with the flood." Well, again, we've seen it in the Bible. Water often signifies the waters of chaos. The Jews weren't seafaring people. They didn't like to go out in the open ocean, okay? Sea of Galilee was about as much as they could handle. But, they saw the ocean as a chaotic, unruly place, barely confined to its limits, its bounds. And this becomes a metaphor for the unruly, disobedient world of unbelieving humanity in its rebellion against God and its persecution of God's people. And doesn't this symbolize history as we see it? History is an unending turmoil of nations in conflict and chaos. Periods of peace throughout history are very short-lived. That's just the way it is. And so this water that the serpent spews out of his mouth after the woman is just another reference to the persecutions of God's people by the powers of this earth. That's all it is. And we're going to see a specific example of that in the next chapter. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. The dragon doesn't succeed because God is protecting his people. He's protecting his people. God remains sovereign over the sea, over the forces of chaos, over the nations. So through the entire period of satanic deception and active persecution of God's people, God protects them against ultimate harm. Psalm 124, I'll give you some examples of this, of how God's sovereignty works here. Psalm 124. "If it had not been the Lord who was on our side, let Israel now say. If it had not been the Lord who was on our side, when people rose up against us, then they would have swallowed us up alive when their anger was kindled against us." He's talking about people, nations, governments, empires that oppress God's people. "Then the flood would have swept us away. The people that are oppressing God's nations are this flood. They would have swept us away. The torrent would have gone over us. Then over us would have gone the raging waters. Blessed be the Lord, who has not given us as prey to their teeth. That's exactly what's going on in this imagery from Revelation. Floods of water are just a way of referring to the persecution of the church by the evil one. Jesus walked on the water of Galilee. Why? To demonstrate his sovereignty over his creation. Okay? Noah's flood. And I'm a literalist. I take that literally. A catastrophe. The Bible describes it as a cataclysm. I think there's only one place where that word is used, and it's in reference to the flood. That literally changed the face of the earth. And the evidence for it is all around us. Wherever you drive through the country, you go through a cut through a hill and you see strata. I believe that's evidence of the flood. But what was the point of Noah's flood? God's sovereign judgment on sinful, violent humanity. At the crossing of the Yam Suf, how many of you remember that phrase from our study of the Exodus? The Yam Suf. It's translated as the Red Sea is a mistranslation. Some people say it's the Sea of Reeds, the mistranslation. Okay? The persecuting army of Pharaoh disappeared beneath the waves from which it spiritually emerged. And this gives more significance to the fact that in chapter 21 we are told, in the new heaven and earth there will be no more sea. Those of you who want to take a cruise, I'm sorry. Those of you who enjoy the beach, I'm sorry. No more sea. Why? Because there will be no more of that which the sea represents. No more chaos. No more satanic deception. No more rebellion against God. No more turmoil among the nations. No more persecution of the church by those nations. God's people will be at peace. And then verse 17, then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring. That's us, Christians in every age. On those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Everyone who keeps God's commandments and holds to the testimony of Jesus is in the crosshairs of the dragon. And he stood on the sand of the sea. Now, do you understand the significance of that? What I just said about the sea. He stood on the shore of the sea to summon from the sea of chaos, from the raging turmoil of the nations, an instrument in his war on the offspring of the woman. And in the next chapter, we're going to see what that instrument is. The beast from the sea, who emerges again and again and again and again through history. I'm going to stop.